Good to see so many familiar faces. So, welcome to Messy Conversations, second one of our spring quarter. Um, and I have a couple of announcements, and then I'll introduce our conversationalist, and we'll get started. Um, as always, if you want to, for whatever reason, protect your privacy, please feel free to not have your video on. And remember that you can, somewhere in Zoom, you can change your name to whatever you want it to be and be anonymous. Um, uh, as always, we will have our conversationalist in conversation for a half an hour or so, and then we will open it up for questions and comment from the audience. Most helpful to us, if you have a question or a comment you'd like to make, if you would put it in the chat. And then, because I try to weave those together in some coherent way so that they build upon one another. So please utilize the chat for any of that. What else do I have? Well, just mention, I hope you've been enjoying the pink moon over the past weekend. It was gorgeous. Next week, third messy conversation of our spring quarter, Jane Paul, who many of you know, and Aaron Kaplan will be joined by Damian Goodman to talk about gentrification and race. There's a lot going on in Los Angeles and around these issues right now, so it should be a really terrific conversation. That'll be next Monday at 4 o'clock Pacific time. I can't think of any other announcements. Anybody on the planning team have anything that I'm overlooking? If not, then let me introduce our speakers today. So today we'll be looking at the history and resistance to HBCUs. We came up with this topic back at the beginning of the year. You might recall that in February, Black History Month, there were a number of, quite a few, bomb threats called in to HBCUs across the country, as well as other black institutions. And we thought, well, let's see if we can get a topic out of this. And I reached out to Patrick, who always comes through for us, and he said, I know exactly the man to talk to. So let me introduce the Honorable Frank Jackson, who is the former Assistant Vice Chancellor for State Relations at Prairie View A&M in Texas, an important HBCU there. He's very active in politics in Prairie View, serving on the city council for a number of years, and then also the mayor of Prairie View, 2002 through 14. He's an author. We learned today, a collector of African masks from the African diaspora. He's a community leader, student advocate, and a recognized expert on the history of Prairie View A&M. So we're very grateful to have Mr. Jackson with us. And then many of you will recognize Dr. Patrick Jefferson. He's been with us a number of times as a conversationalist and a big supporter of Messy Conversations. He's the Director of Student Academic Support Services at Prairie View A&M, Go Panthers, where he's served in a number of roles. He's an educator, active in the community, on the board of Elevate Collegiate Charter School, as well as 100 Black Men of Metro Houston. And he took his doctorate locally at UCLA in educational leadership. So welcome, Patrick and Frank. We're really glad to have you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We thought, and I was thinking, instead of kind of going very broad and general, we'll get very specific, with a very specific institution, one of the oldest historically Black institutions in America, Prairie View A&M University. And Mr. Jackson is widely regarded as a historian of our campus. And so I asked him to come join us. So I'm going to give him some questions, and I'm going to do my best to get out of his way because he's a wealth of knowledge, super engaging. We can sit and listen to him, for hours. And, it's a tradition in our community of, our storytellers, and he lives up to that tradition 1,000%. So we're going to start off kind of setting some context, and then we'll get to some more specifics around the challenges and issues that come up, structural issues, societal issues and challenges, and even legal and, government issues that come up. And then we'll hopefully be able to open it up to have some questions to kind of, really pick his brain and see, and answer your question, what you want to know. And so, Mr. Jackson, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and could you just give us a little history of how Prairie View came to be? I know that's a huge, bigger question than just a few minutes, but just give us a little history of that and then the context, and then we kind of go into the next question.
Yes, first of all, again, thank you, each and every one of you on the organizing committee and those that are in attendance to the Zoom call for inviting yours to be a part of this messy conversation. I'm looking forward to your questions and your comments. In order to kind of put this in some kind of context, I always like to start with Dr. Du Bois and his book on Souls of Black Folk. I think he kind of sets the stage. And I'm gonna paraphrase one chapter, some excerpts from one chapter on the training of Black for the world of work. And in that book, he talks about these three streams of thinking that came down to us from the death ship. And basically he was saying that once European knowledge, it became this organized knowledge, they'd come to believe that God had so blessed their enterprise that it was their duty to subdue the earth and all men, black, brown, yellow, white, and form this new humanity. He said this larger humanity tried to feel the striving from this contact of living nations and sleeping hordes, the thrill of a new life. But he said behind that thought was an afterthought of force and dominion, the making of black and brown and yellow men to delve from the temptation of beads and red calico with Chloe. He said the second thought that came down to us from the death ship were the thoughts of the older South. And here in Texas, we're part of the older South, the Dixie. He said the older Southerners fervently and passionately believed that somewhere between man and cattle, God created this tertium quid, this intermediate thing, and called it a Negro, a simple clownish creature, yet lovable within its limitations. But Dr. Bowe said behind that thought was a dark afterthought that the older Southerners also knew that perhaps by chance, some of them may become living men. Some of them may learn to use their intellect. So out of pure self-defense, they said, we dare not let them. So they decided to build around us a wall so wide and placed between us and any knowledge of veil so thick that we would not even think of breaking through. And he said the third and the darkest thought that trickled down to us from the death ship were the thoughts of the things themselves. He said, you'd ask the average Negro back and say 1901, what do you want? They would say, vouchsafe for us, O boastful world, the chances of living men, freedom, opportunity, equality. He said, but behind that thought was an even darker afterthought that all those years of bondage, after all those hundreds of years of living behind that veil, even the Negro had come to believe that perhaps the world is right. Perhaps we're not like other men. Perhaps this is some mock mirage from the untrue. And in thinking of America and the selling and the colonization of America, and in Texas in particular, we know that they had two problems, in my opinion. One, they had to seize the land and they had to exterminate the Indians. But once they had exterminated them in the South and started growing their cotton, they started pushing westward. And Stephen F. Austin, who's known as the father of Texas, he's also known as the father of slavery in Texas. Stephen F. Austin came into Texas after his dad and Moses Austin had gotten this land grant from the Spanish, and Mexicans or Spaniards. And so now you had this new republic that you had to deal with. Stephen F. Austin came in trying to get land for the businessmen, the landed aristocracy of the South to come into Texas. And he wanted to bring in slaves. But what threw him for a curve was that the second president of the Republic of Mexico was an Afro-Mexican named Vicente Guerrero. Well, that kind of spoiled his plan. So Austin changed it up a little bit, but he finally got his grant to bring us in as indentures. And he told his original 300, and what they call the old 300, they say for each Negro that you bring into Texas, he would give them an extra 80 acres of land.
He froze for just 1 minute. He should pop back in a second. He's out in Prairie View, and it's outside the city a little bit. So he warned us he'll pop back on. It kind of gets unreliable. So we'll give him a second. He gave us forewarning. See, I told you. See, just when it started getting good, I mean, I told you he's a storyteller.
I thought it was a perfect moment for a pregnant pause to let it sink in.
All right, we give him a second. Oh, look like he's popping back on. There you go. See,
I'm gonna try to make it quicker.
all right.
George Nelson Gross's son, Leonard Waller Gross, who owned the Leandro plantation, which is 2 miles from the current city of Prairie View, he got 66,000 acres of land. Waller County is named after Gross's nephew, Edwin Waller. Edwin Waller was one of the first to sign the Texas Declaration of Independence. He was asked by the president of Texas, Marbu Lamar, to locate the capital for the new republic. He chose the current town of Austin in the first. So his family dynasty arise here on the banks of the Brazos River. But one of the things that I found interesting is that over at the Alamo, when Santa Anna came up, he brought 2 regiments of African troops out of Veracruz. So blacks not only fought with the Texans, they fought with the Mexicans as well. And now the Mexican historians are saying that Santa Anna came up here to free the slaves because he knew if he could free the slaves, he would break the backs of the wealthy planters. And at the Alamo, they shared with me a copy of a newspaper written in that era. And it says that when the Mexicans went over the wall of the Alamo, the first thing one of the colonels asked, are there any Negroes here? And Joe, who was Travis's slave, came out of hiding and basically said, here I am, or here I is, one of those phrases. And one of the troops tried to stab him with a bat. And the colonel blocked it with his saber and said, we have no war with the Negro, you're free to go. So Joe walked out of the Alamo. You know, the story was all the men died. No, they didn't. Joe walked out. Joe gave an eyewitness account of that battle. And he met Sam Houston down at Gonzales, and they started running from Santa Ana, and they crossed the Brazos River here at Gross's ferry. Old man Gross had built a ferry that crosses the Brazos River, and it was there that Sam Houston, who had been sent for by Gross. It was Gross that had actually sent for Sam Houston to come into Texas to kind of lead this rebellion. And I'm thinking now, and I'm still doing some research, that him and Andrew Jackson had this plot going all along. But anyway, Sam Houston was able to get his forces fed, horses refreshed, ammunition, and they eventually caught Santa Ana over on the San Jacinto side. And we know the battle, the rest of it is history. Well, after that war, they passed laws that no free black be in Texas. It took an act of the Texas Congress for a free Negro to even be in Texas. And even the war, Edwin Waller was one of the first to sign the Articles of Secession from the Union. So this family dynasty is still playing in this game, and that is the environments. Old man Gross had a great nephew named Jared Ellison Kirby. Jared Ellison Kirby had several plantations and several farms, and when he married Helen Moss Swearingen, her father, who was a medical doctor across the Brazos River in a settlement called Chapel Hill, he bought her a tract of land they call Alta Vista. And Alta Vista is the current town of Prairie View. It was purchased as a wedding gift, and they had about 150 slaves on this plantation. Many of them are buried out. north in a historic cemetery that we have a state historical mark on now. But this was plantation economy up and down this Brazos River. Gross's daughter, Sarah Ann, one of the wardens, and they built the Eagle Island plantation down the Brazos River, and they started growing sugar cane. So down in what is now Sugar Land, all that's cotton. So it was the cotton and the sugar that built Texas. And it was Gross's money that eventually helped them to build a railroad, all that was out. But when the Civil War hit, there were 3 Confederate training camps in and around what is now Prairie View. There was Camp Carter, Camp Gross, and Camp Abair. Camp Gross was a prisoner of war camp for Union prisoners, but those other 2 were Confederate training camps. And we got historical markers kind of near where they existed. But that idea that you had the Confederacy here in Waller County so strong that when the war ended, we know as African Americans, we celebrate Juneteenth as the day the Union General Gordon Granger landed at Galveston Island in General Order number 3 and basically the Emancipation Proclamation. But word didn't get up to Waller County on June 19th. Word didn't get up here around August the 25th when George Armstrong Custer and 2 regiments, I believe, of cavalry troops rode into Hempstead. And we kept asking, why did Custer come to Hempstead? Well, we now know that Custer came into Hempstead because there was a 3-star Confederate general named Edmund Kirby Smith. He was the 3-star Confederate general in charge of the Trans-Mississippi Command. His headquarters during the final phases of the Civil War were at his cousin's plantation called Alta Vista. And the other Confederate generals that didn't surrender came into Texas, and they were going to wait on Jefferson Davis, who eventually got caught. But this kind of sets the stage that Texas never had in its cultural memory that it actually lost the war. So Kirby Smith hightailed it out of here because he figured they was going to hang him. But now you had the stage set. Well, what do you now do with all these newly freed Negroes that were here on these plantations in this Brazos River Bottoms, or what people call the Brazos Bottoms? Well, the Northern businessmen were the real winners of the Civil War. And you had the likes of George Foster Peabody and William Baldwin, all these boys up north. The Northern capitalists got with their intellectuals, and they hired the president of Brown University, Barnard Sears, to be their agent to come into the South. And they met with the Southern aristocracy and their intellectuals. And the whole idea was, what we gonna do with the Negro? And they pretty much resolved themselves that they would use education as a technique for social control. They would change the culture of the South to answer the dictates of the industrial economy through the minds of the children. They didn't do it with troops, but they would do it through the minds of the children. So the education became the new battleground for this war. And so that kind of sets the stage for Prairie View. And what kind of helped situations to get Prairie View moving, that in this same, what is now Waller County, named after Gross's nephew, Edwin Waller. What happened in Waller County, there's another plantation about 15 miles from Prairie View named the Sunnyside Plantation. It was owned by a guy named Philip Cuny. Philip Cuny had been married twice, and he had a slave mistress named Adeline Stewart. She had several babies for him, girls and boys. He sent the girls to France to school because they were all mulattoes, how yellow. And he sent the boys to the Wild Street School for Negroes in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, ran by the Vachon family. This is the same family that took in Martin Delaney and Frederick Douglass. And young Norris Wright Cuny came back into Texas. He was a mulatto and he was educated. And Norris Wright Cuny eventually, once African-American men got the right to vote, he became the leader of that group. He became the first Grand Master of Prince Hall Masons in Texas. And Norris Wright Cuny rose to prominence and power to head the Republican Party in Texas. So now you had Black men voting and you had Black men pushing. And here in this area, Waller County, we had 2 state senators then. We had Walter Burton from what is now Waller County and Fort Bend County. We had Matthew Gaines across the river. We had George White, who was a state rep from right here. You had William Holland from a state rep right in Hempstead. So now you had political power, and you had Cuny pushing for economic power, because Cuny eventually had learned the game of the economics from his daddy. And he moved to Galveston. He started getting control of the docks in Galveston. So this became the new threat. So by 1876, these boys had to stop the clock and had to turn it back. So the idea became get CUNY. And eventually the lily white Republicans and the Southern Democrats, who were the blood enemies of CUNY, eventually got together and refused to sit as delegation at the National Convention. And so we start seeing a lot of things happen from Texas, especially the black codes and all this stuff started rolling back, what we call that Jim Crow era. But one of the things that I found very interesting when thinking about Prairie View is when they passed the law in 1876 to create this land grant college, which all these states were entitled to, that the Southerners had rebelled against when they first introduced it. So when they left the Congress around 1862, they passed the Land Grant College Act. So Texas now wanted that Land Grant College Act. And so when they passed it, they did not make a provision for Black men. And so because we had Walter Burden and Matthew Gaines and these other guys in the Texas legislature, they called a tech. And so they had to come back in special session and on August 14th created A&M College for colored youth. But A&M College in College Station was created for white males only. And it remained for white males only from 1876 up until about 1962. So you see this long history of really trying to develop leadership that gave this idea of white power, white dominance, or white supremacy. And they had here at Prairie View, they had to locate a place. And so the governor, Richard Koch at that time, formed a committee, a commission he called it, led by another guy named Ashbel Smith. And they came into Waller County and met with Edwin Waller, Gross's nephew. He took him out to his cousin's plantation, gave her the hookup because her plantation had fallen on hard times, especially after her husband, Colonel Kirby, had been killed over in a saloon fight in Hempstead. And she sold the plantation to the state of Texas. She moved to Austin, and when they opened up the University of Texas, Ashbel Smith became the first president of the University of Texas. She became the first dean of women. So we see this family dynasty keeps growing in power. And now I'm gonna pause right there and we'll go from there now.
All right, that's so now specifically the founding of Prairie View, and then I want to move into some of the challenges from the state legislature as far as funding and all that stuff like that, and how that's been a challenge. Because I mean, the bomb threats are one thing, somebody calls in, some wackadoo calls in, but I want to get into the systemic, sustained efforts to close the door of Prairie View and other institutions like it.
Well, Prairie View's had many challenges, but again, this was an experiment. The experiment started at Hampton University, and that's where Booker T. Washington was educated. When Booker T. graduated and went down to Tuskegee, you look at his board of directors, you're gonna see the same cast of characters. These Northern captains, Baldwin, all these, Peabody, all these boys show up. The experiment in Texas was Prairie View. And now the state had control over it. They didn't believe that, like DuBose was saying, you're gonna spend money on who? You're gonna waste our tax dollars on what? Educating African Americans or Negroes? It didn't compute. So you had a change because they started running Blacks out of public office. And so the last African American to serve in Texas was in 1899. They ran the brother out of office then. And so from 1899 to the election of Barbara Jordan, that long span of years, the highest ranking appointed state official in Texas was the principal/president of Prairie View. So you only had one Negro to deal with. And to understand that, it's when Richard Koch, in 1876, when they created A&M College and eventually created Prairie View, they had to find a president. The governor, Richard Koch, wrote a letter to Jefferson Davis, invited Jefferson Davis, the ex-president of the Confederacy, to come into Texas and be the president for both A&M and Texas and Prairie View. But he respectfully declined. He said, but I'm gonna send you a man out of Mississippi. And he sent Thomas Gothright, and he told him to bring a colored man for Prairie View to be the principal out here. So we didn't have a president. We had a president that was always at A&M. We had a principal, and he brought L.W. Minor. and they reminded the main streets that run through the campus in front of the administration building. Both of them came, both president and the principal came on the recommendation of Jefferson Davis. So it kind of lets you know the attitude or the domination that they had over Prairie View, because we used the old plantation house and everything was in the house. And it took us 2 years after formation of the university in 1876 to find students, because prior to 1865, it was illegal to teach African Americans how to read or write. So if we got caught reading or writing, we got tied to a whipping post and got the hell beat out of us. And so education was something we had to do underground or behind the veil, but underground. And so now you're gonna say, we're gonna create a college. Where are you gonna find college students? It took us 2 years to find 8 young men that could come to what we could call a college. So that was the inside joke. And so those kids showed up on March 11th, 1878, but they couldn't finish the first year because they had to go back home and help their families pick cotton to raise money. So the board of directors over at A&M, most of them ex-Confederates, saying, well, see, they're not ready for higher education. So they wanted to close the place down. But again, because we had African Americans in the Texas legislature at the time, they called it Tech. William Holland out of Hempstead, state representative, is known as the father of Prairie View. He lobbied and pushed to reopen Prairie View. So Prairie View reopened its doors in 1879, and this time we admitted Black women. And so Prairie View is one of the older, probably if not the oldest, co-educational state-supported institution in Texas. So women are now pretty much the majority of Prairie View, even to the day.
All right, could you, and we'll go a little bit longer and then we'll try to open it up for questions. Let's talk about financing and the colleges of the first class and the money that came along with that. Can you go into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, the first trick came once they start realizing that they had to share this knowledge thing with us. That battleground, the battle was set. And so the state decided that once they're gonna open the University of Texas, appropriation that should have came to Prairie View and use it to open up the University of Texas at Austin. Again, the first president was Jefferson, the former plantation owner, Mrs. Kirby, all the cast and characters were there. And so they didn't even have enough money to pay the salaries of the people that were here, feed the children. So the local farmers had to bring food over to the campus, chickens and vegetables and stuff that they were growing to feed the children. Mr. Montgomery, who was noted for being an excellent watermelon grower, he also had supplies that he brought over here to help feed the kids. And this poverty and lack of attention to Prairie View followed us all through the years. And so even though the Constitution said it and created us, it took up until 1984 for us to have a referendum on the ballot to get approved to re-recognize Prairie View as the institution of the first class. And when you read the notes from the Legislative Council there in Austin, they said designating Prairie View as a university of first class without setting it up as its own regents and its own board and outside of the A&M system was merely symbolic, because it's still going to be under the control of the A&M system. And just so for the record, out of the years that we've been created since 1876, we've never had a Prairie View graduate on the board of regents of the A&M system. So the money went to A&M, and it was growing students to be in leadership roles, whether it's in the military, whether it's in industry. And this followed us on through the years. And so I'll give you real quick, each principal out at Prairie View, from L.W. Mine, each time they tried to raise Prairie View up a significant level of academic, they got fired. They didn't last. L.C. Anderson created the African American Teachers Association of the state of Texas, and he started pushing for books And the state representative Wilhelmina Delco notes that when Anderson went to Austin to lobby the legislature to get books for the college students, when he came back, the A&M board was so mad at him, they had all of his stuff sitting out on the side of the road. And so he was fired. Hired another African-American academic named Edward Lavoisier Blackshear, very well educated young man. They call him Big Red, but Blackshear practiced what they call blue veinism. In other words, if you're African, you see the blue-green veins in you had more white blood, so you got special privileges here at Prairie View. And so Blackshear, at his inauguration, 1897, the great Booker T. Washington was the guest speaker. And so on the stage that day was Booker T. Washington, Saul Ross, who was past governor of Texas and now president of Texas A&M, and you had Blackshear, and you had Robert Lloyd Smith. When they finished that day, Robert Lloyd Smith would be a member of the Texas legislature. So in 1897, by 1899, Robert Lloyd Smith was out of office. And again, you did not get another African-American to represent Prairie View in Austin until 1966. So there was nobody there fighting to get Prairie View the appropriations that it needed. Even when we went through the 40s and trying to create with the law school with Hema Sweat case, the state did all kind of gymnastics to try to keep from doing it. But eventually they was going to set the law school at Prairie View, and Thurgood Marshall and NAACP fought against it. They did not want that law school for African Americans under the control of the A&M system because they didn't believe that they would be fair to Prairie View. So they boycotted. And eventually they went and did some gymnastics with the Constitution and created Texas Southern University and put the law school at Texas Southern. They created a whole new university to keep Hema Sweat from going to the University of Texas, even though Hema Sweat did not go to Texas Southern, but they created a whole new university with the law school to do this strong, this idea of domination reigned in Texas. So Prairie View did not get the funding that it needed. Even down to my time, when I showed up here in 1969, it was a one-lane road leading into the campus, no lights, it was pitch dark, and a lot of the streets wasn't paved, there was no grass, the buildings were dilapidated, it was terrible. We argued and fought for just to get hot water. Older dormitories, some of them had been there since the 19 teens and 20s, and they were falling down. But this is what we went through. We didn't start getting a piece of the available university fund from the permanent university fund, which is the interest of the permanent university fund, after the amendment passed in 1984. So it took 85 and 86 to start getting a piece of the money. Then you start seeing the grass coming, you saw sidewalks, you saw beautification, and you saw more control of the finances of Prairie View by the Board of A&M.
So I just want to kind of talk about a little bit. So University of Texas, Texas A&M, Prairie View, these were some of the first institutions in Texas.
State supported.
And state supported. Now we all we can look. Has anybody ever been to Austin and saw the University of Texas? I mean, it's huge. I mean, they have 55, 60,000 students at this point. It's a whole thing. Texas A&M, not quite as big as UT, but we know UT, big, huge, tier 1, world-renowned research institution. Texas A&M, R1 research institution. Texas A&M basically is College Station. If you move Texas A&M out of College Station would have one red light. Yeah. You got Prairie View. Now the state will pump a whole lot of money. If you go to state legislature, you on the A&M side or you on the UT side, and they pump money in. But Prairie View, starting in 1876, did not get the kind of money to grow and develop and attract students and do research and do service as those other two institutions. And it was not just by accident, it was by design. And where these three state support institutions, UT got to be its own thing. A&M got to be its own thing. And by logic, you would think Prairie View should have been its own thing. No, they took Prairie View and stuck it under Texas A&M. And you know, and you know, and A&M, it's A&M is in UT. If you look at them, A&M has a certain kind of reputation. So if you wanted to keep control of, quote unquote Negroes back in the day, you would put them under the auspices of the people at A&M. It's kind of a different, idea of what A&M is versus what UT is, especially back in that time. And so I just want to highlight that, how that was purposely done to kind of try to choke off the university and to try to starve it, basically. But I also think it's a testament, not only to Prairie View, but many institutions around the nation where the buildings may have been falling down, it may have not been hot water, it may not be this and maybe that, but students came and they persevered and they went through. And on many campuses across America, students built buildings. They went to class in the morning and they did construction in the afternoon. They physically put bricks and laid tile and put up drywall for the very buildings that some of them may have ended up learning in or sleeping in, but may not have. They was building for whoever came after them, physically putting together buildings. Some of you know I'm a graduate of Xavier University in New Orleans. Many of our people that came before me in Xavier, they were cutting the limestone for the buildings that went on the administration building. So they actually went to school, like I said, in the morning and built buildings in the afternoon. So that's a testament to what it means. All right. So I just kind of want to kind of highlight that. So Dave, you want to open up the questions? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Jefferson.
Yeah, same case with Prairie View. The students built many of the buildings, the 5 structures that we have on the National Register for Historic Places were housing, many of them was housing that students actually made the brick, and they were designed by the African Americans at Prairie View, but they couldn't sign the documents. They had to take them over to A&M and have them sign them. We got all of the passed down from A&M when they got tired of generators or whatever, they passed it down to Prairie View. So they used the hand-me-downs to make things work, old trucks or devices. And we had 2 guys, the Fry brothers, that were really, some say were multi-level geniuses. So they took those old generators and created a radio station. But you couldn't hear the radio unless you got close to the telephone wire. They broadcast through the telephone system. But one of the other brothers was an architect that drew the design for the buildings. And again, he couldn't sign the document. He had to take it over to A&M and let them sign. So we got these buildings on the National Register, mainly because they were largely built by students. We taught brick masonry, we taught metallurgy, taught all of the mechanics, drafting, and I was an industrial education major when I first came to Prairie View. And so I learned to use the lathes and the box and pan brakes and all that stuff and make hammers and stuff. But that was part of that industrial education idea. When we passed the amendment to the Constitution, our new president at that time, Dr. Pierre, got rid of a lot of the trades and said the university of the first class need to be more academic. But I think we threw the baby with the bathwater because Prairie View was, as a land grant, was known in the community. The university was a mecca for Negro Interscholastic League activities since the 1920s. African Americans would come here for their interscholastic league competitions, track and field competitions, football playoffs. So Prairie View's coaches had to pick of the litter. So Prairie View was a powerhouse. And one time I was giving a tour to the SWAC coaches as they were doing that tour, and Coach Eddie Roberts, and I was catching a lot of flack because Prairie View had that notorious 80-game losing streak going at the time. And so a lot of the coaches were giving me a lot of grief. And so Coach Eddie Robertson took the microphone. He said, look, y'all don't know Prairie View. He said, back in the day, Prairie View had all the other schools trembling in their boots because they were getting the key athletes coming out of these Black schools, because all they had to do was walk out to the field and pick the litter. They just got who they wanted. So it kind of tells the story of how these schools were meaningful to those communities. and they were the ag teachers in those communities. They're the ones that had the new farmers of America, new homemakers of America. They would come to Prairie View, do their debates and opening and closing meetings. They were good at this stuff. But then when we desegregated, all that went away. It went away. And in my hometown of Luling, Texas, small community, Orwell town, first a railhead town. But when I went back to do research on my hometown in 1982, I went to the superintendent of the schools and asked for the records. I wanted to see all the records so I could do a demographic stuff and some other. He said, well, let's go see the principal. So we went over to the principal's office and he took me in the vault where they keep all of the records. And I saw these lines of 4 and 5 drawer file cabinets. And he said, no, Frank, what you're looking for is in that corner. It was a 2 drawer file cabinet. The top drawer was empty. The second drawer had a manila folder with just some detention hall slips and other trash in it. I said, well, where are the records from the black school? We've had a black school since the 1880s up until 1965. Where are our records? He said, well, Frank, when we integrated, we brought the materials over from Rosenwald. It was a Rosenwald school, again, Northern capitalist. It was a Rosenwald school. They brought the materials over to the white school, put it in an old building, all the trophies, the yearbooks. And he said the rats got on it, and mice and the mold got on it. So they took all of the records to the city dump and burned it. So if you graduated from Rosenwald High School, Luling, Texas, prior to 1965, you can't prove it. And they only hired 3 women teachers from the black community, 2 in the lower grades, 1 in high school. She taught home economics. So there were no male teachers hired. At the capital of Caldwell County, where I'm from in Lockhart, Texas, they hired 0. And so those communities had a vacuum of leadership. So nobody was there to really run the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the social clubs. And you start seeing the communities collapse on themselves. And you go there now, they look like deserts.
I would want to say one thing though, if, the struggles that, not having sidewalks or having grass. I've been at 5 higher education institutions. Prairie View is the most gorgeous campus I've ever seen in my life. I mean, seriously, if you ever come to Houston and take the time to drive to Prairie View, it looks like one of the, you see those movies that set on the college campus and you have the old trees and the green, the grass goes on and on and on. It is like that. It is the most tranquil, most beautiful campus you ever want to see in your life. There are people that come back that graduated, a long time ago, and they come back and they get to campus and they start crying because they remember having to walk through the puddles and the mud and having to walk around, and they see it now and they start crying because it is such a gorgeous campus. So I just want to make sure everybody left with the right impression of what Prairie View is today. So David, you want to open it up for questions?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. We don't yet have questions or comments in the chat, so I encourage those of you that want to get in on this to post something there. I do, however, see Lewis Thomas has his hand up. Lewis?
Yeah, what I wanted to say was too much to write in the chat. So first of all, thank you so much for coming. It's so good to see you. I'm a proud graduate of America's oldest historically Black degree granting university, Lincoln University of Pennsylvania, and the Howard University. But I am a descendant of a graduate of Houston Tillotson College, right down in Texas, which is a small HBCU where he graduated. My grandfather, who was born in 1899 in San Marcos, Texas, went when it was still Tillotson College. And of course, I grew up here, but of course, when he graduated from that school, that's how he got up to Philadelphia. He and his brother graduated from Tillotson College. His brother was lynched when they went back to San Marcos to open up a store there, a hardware store. His brother was lynched and my grandfather fled to Philadelphia and of course, met my grandmother and had a family. But when I hear your voice, you remind me of my grandfather, actually, that Texas tone. But my question is, so it's great to just have an opportunity to hear. When I saw this topic, I was just immediately drawn to it. My question is that this idea that you all were just talking about in terms of the split between state universities and some of the more private HBCUs have historically been an ongoing struggle. For instance, here in Pennsylvania, we have two HBCUs, Cheney, which is a state university, and of course, Lincoln, the university I graduated from, which is not a state university. And I have continually found, if you go throughout the country to HBCUs, back in that time, the state universities were treated so poorly and badly by the states that kind of were charged with the responsibility of financing them. And you still see in some of the states some of these same things occurring. So if you can speak to that, there still is this split. I often find that Lincoln and Cheney, who obviously are rivals, you can see the differences when you go to the universities. As Cheney has been a state school for all these years, and Lincoln, was not. But I would just like to say, to Dr. Jefferson's point, all HBCUs are beautiful campuses today. I mean, if you go to most HBCUs, we take enormous pride in maintaining our universities and our campuses. So if you could just speak to that point, that would be helpful, since you all brought up that as it relates to how Prairie View was treated under the control of the state system.
But again, and I make a point, I defer to Patrick on some of this. My comments would be that, again, after the war, the question became, what do you now do with them? Do you make them competitive with white civil society? Do you raise them up to where they can actually compete? Or do you control it, put them in that box? Do you create that box, that second-class citizenship? And that's what was done, using education as a technique for social control, to shape it, regardless of whether it was in the public or the private. And I say the private probably called it a little worse because they wanted the control of the churches. So now you had another entity that they had to deal with. And if funding cut off from the big church, they died, like Bishop College and others, they die on the vine. So at least the state schools, you could lobby the government to pump something in, but they would never make you equal to them. That was an idea that they considered absurd. How dare you think you're equal? We think we should have been equal. Each time we were able to move Prairie View up, and I say we, but the leadership, those principles and presidents didn't last long. And it's just interesting to see that even at Prairie View, say in the 50s, our first African-American president was Dr. E.B. Evans. Dr. Evans was a noted veterinarian. Eventually he became our president after they started wrestling about this Hema Sweat case. The only reason we got an African-American president was that A&M decided to get a chancellor and put the president of Prairie View in that line now. We were in that chain of command now. Instead of a principal, a president, then had to raise the university up to be a college instead of just another branch out there just floating on its own. So that was part of that Hema Sweat stuff. When you look at that Hema Sweat, you see all these gymnastics being done by the state and by the system. But again, it didn't bring the money. And even at Prairie View in the 50s, what Dr. Evans would do, when the board of directors from A&M would come to campus, they would go in the old dining hall, which was built in the 30s, Hilliard Hall is, again, one of those buildings listed on the National Register. But on the second floor of Hilliard Hall was a room for whites only. And they had their own china, their own crystal, their own silverware in that room. And when the board came to Prairie View, Dr. Evans couldn't go in the room. He had to sit out in the hall. So the first intercom on campus was in Hilliard Hall so that the board could talk to Dr. Evans sitting out in the hall. So this idea of dominance, second-class citizenship was there, even though this was a good man. And when he would go to A&M to meetings, he had to go up the back to the service elevator and go through the kitchen and sit out in the hall. Now, how do you reconcile this, and you're saying you're fighting for parity, you're fighting for equity. I've seen senators go crazy when a president would present his legislative appropriation request and ask for parity of salary. How dare you? Aren't you happy with what we've done for you? What's wrong with you? And I've seen them change it, the language, so that, you know, the students didn't understand. And I know when I was a student, I didn't understand the dominance. I was fortunate enough as a junior to accompany Dr. Navin Thomas to my first legislative session. And we met with the House Appropriations Committee. And Dr. Thomas was there because people had said that he was misusing funds, a whole bunch of garbage. So when he gave his presentation, he used a flip chart and he showed not enough books in the library and had cobwebs on some of the shelves. No hot water. This was in 72. No hot water in a lot of the raggedy streets and just poor physical plant maintenance. And so he was asking like $25,000 to upgrade some of this stuff. By like token, they said, well, we're gonna hold your request, Dr. Thomas, but we gotta investigate you. And the president of A&M gave a talk. He asked for $24 million for a cyclotron machine. And I said, God, what is a cyclotron? I didn't know. But fast forward, A&M now controls the Los Alamos plant. That cyclotron back then played a part. You know, when you start looking at this, you say, wait a minute, this is mind-boggling, because you see this stuff play out over time, and it shows you, regardless of whether it's public or private, there's this domination. That's what DuBose kept telling us, is that you got to look at this thing. This race thing matters, because one of the things that kind of helped me to understand it a little bit better, and I'm still learning, is that I had a chance to go over to the Milton plantation over there outside of Charleston. And I went out there and I saw that the Miltons were so wealthy, they had 2 mansions. And the kids only spoke French in the house, and the boys got to a certain age, they sent them off to Oxford or Cambridge. But then when they got married, they gave them a global tour, worldwide tour. And I could imagine in my mind that some of those boys landed in West Africa and saw that African Americans had positions of prominence and power. Some of them went down the Mediterranean, sailed up the Nile River, and went through those tombs of Egypt and saw those hieroglyphics. When they got back home, they tried to say, Daddy, I saw somebody on the tomb that looked like old Toby. Toby was a pharaoh. Daddy, we don't put our foot on Toby's neck. We'll be on Toby. Because they knew this human intellect, once it arrived, we all the same. So they had to control it in order to maintain position and power. And here in Texas, you still see it. They fighting critical race theory. They fight everything, you know, that tells us to look at this stuff. And that's all we've been asking, saying we haven't been told the truth all these years. We've been treated as second-class citizens, and we're not going anywhere. We're gonna stay here. We're gonna build America. We all part of this enterprise. You see, at Prairie View, we've always, we started Army ROTC, and we started commissioning officers around 1944. And then one of our presidents, again, Dr. Avenard Thomas, was able to get with Bush and Old Man Bush and a couple of other folks, Lyndon Johnson, and they got the Naval ROTC at Prairie View, the first HBCU in the country to have a Naval ROTC program. But Dr. Thomas had to take us to his house as freshmen and teach us how to eat in a wardroom, because most of us didn't have the formal training, the knife and fork training and stirring tea. But he also made us read the books off the bestseller list. The Wall Street Journal made us read all the magazines and books, and we had these discussions. Then we had to learn to play chess, backgammon, and we was wondering why Dr. Thomas was drilling us. And once we went aboard those ships and sit in those formal wardrooms, especially with the officers, it was a different world. Many of us didn't know about that world. You had your own napkin ring, china, crystal, silverware, and you had to know how to get the potatoes out of the bowl. But the conversation was going around the table about current events and books, so we could keep up with it. And then when you get through eating, you go over to the little space and you play games. They say, Frank, can you play chess? I said, well, I play a little bit. We played every day. But they were getting us ready for a different world. And so we got 3-star admirals out of the deal. We got one guy, Joseph B. Combs, that helped design the Los Angeles class nuclear attack submarine. I mean, so we've been participating in this thing and this enterprise, and all we ask for is that our people get a chance at a level playing field And we're going to contribute, we're going to keep contributing, but we're going to also make America come and live up to the true meaning of its creed.
And just go, I went to, once again, Xavier, which was a private institution, which was funded by, founded and funded by Catherine Drexel. I think she's, for those of Catholics, she's sainted at this point, St. Catherine Drexel. Well, she was a Boston heiress. She had a whole bunch of money. So she ended up starting Xavier for African Americans and Native Americans in New Orleans. There's a long history of African Americans, Native Americans kind of in the same communities. And because she had her own money, she can do that. But it's a Catholic institution because she went into the, she was a nun. And so because the city and the state could not control her money, they were attached to the Catholic Church. The Archbishop had connections with the mayor and the state and all that kind of stuff like that. So whatever they wanted to do, they went through him because he had a final say. And even though it was her money, she founded the school, was paying for everything because she was a woman and she was a nun. She still was subordinate to the male clergy. And that's how they got Xavier to kind of do what they wanted to do and kind of move them and what subjects they could offer and what courses they can teach and all that kind of stuff like that. So it, once again, it's about dominance and control. So I kind of wanted to touch base about that. And just to kind of reiterate something Mr. Jackson said about the importance of having a, you know, an ROTC on campus and being able to these, you know, African-American men in particular, going in the service as officers was a huge deal instead of going in as just enlisted, not just, but going in as enlisted men. But the notion that you will go in as an officer and have some kind of authority based on your rank, you know, a formal authority based on your rank was a huge, huge, huge deal. I mean, and that's something that, you know, you earned and can take away from you. That was a huge deal. So having that naval ROTC and the ROTC there was, you know, a big, big deal. So I want to kind of reiterate how huge that was.
Yeah, that was a game changer for most of us. See, like kids like myself coming out of Luling, Texas, where the only jobs we could get were working in watermelon fields or hay fields or cotton fields. And I was one of those kids that wasn't supposed to go to college. But my father couldn't afford to send me to technical school because they asked for like $200 for tuition. He only made $1 per haircut. He was a local barber. My mother was a maid, but she took me to her sister that lived in Houston. Her sister had a friend that said she knew somebody that could get me in Prairie View. And so I had to take ROTC. I took naval ROTC, got a commission as a naval officer, and had a chance to travel all over the world, mostly on warships. My first ship was a nuclear powered guided missile cruiser. So I had to go aboard there and compete with guys from the Naval Academy, Notre Dame. And so, you know, it changed. It was a game changer for me to get to see the world and read the briefs and see stuff. It opened our eyes to a lot of stuff. And so when the Navy sent me back to Prairie View to teach navigation and ship handling, I wouldn't leave. I stayed and went to work because I knew that it's going to take guys and ladies to come back and help get those kids ready. But because there were some things that we wasn't necessarily doing or wasn't able to do, that other schools were making them more competitive. And it's about competition. This is capitalism. And so we're learning to play the game. And even here in the city of Prairie View, we don't have a bank yet in the city. We don't have a grocery store. And you right in the shadow of a university of the first class, according to the state constitution, and there's no off-campus bookstore. And you say, wait a minute, what's wrong with this? To give you an idea, President Julius Wesley Becton Jr., three-star general, was our president. He asked us to go get an ATM machine on campus. And so we did an RFP to banks within a 25-mile radius of the university. And only one bank responded. And they told us that in order for them to come out here, they'd have to charge us for the machine by $75,000. We had to put $50,000 of the university's money in the machine and then let them charge like 50 cents per transaction for line service charges. We told them, no, we can't do that. We were more colorful with our language. But I went over to A&M and talked to the business manager. I said, how did you get ATMs on A&M campus? He said, Frank, what you talking about? I said, man, how did you get them? He said, Frank, what are you talking about? I said, ATM, the president wants an ATM. He said, Frank, the banks came to us. He said, how many you want? Where do you want them? And we'll assess the 25 or 50 cents for scholarships for your students. We still don't have no bank.
So, Mr. Jackson, I don't know if this is more modern. I don't know how much information you got about this, but recent efforts as far as voting and how the county has made an attempt to split the campus in half as far as voting power and stuff like that for students on campus. Can you touch base that a little bit? Then we'll go some more questions.
Just real quickly before we do that, it is 5 o'clock, and I want to formally wrap up for those who need to leave and to acknowledge both the Honorable Frank Jackson and Dr. Patrick Jefferson for a really rich conversation that.
But I'm not honorable.
I didn't call you honorable. But thank you all. We'll stick around for another 15-20 minutes if anybody wants to hang out and continue this conversation more informally. And remember, we'll see you next week for a discussion on gentrification and race, which should be a good conversation. Thank you all. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. I'll wait so we can get a conversation going. I first came aware of the politics of Waller County when the time I was here teaching Naval ROTC. And so the students were complaining that they couldn't vote. But we had the same problem when I was a student here back in the 70s. And Waller County's elections administrator refused to let students register to vote, said we were not permanent residents, so we couldn't vote. And so long story short, the lawsuit was filed against Waller County. And what tripped it off was that we had a white student that was a member of the Naval ROTC program that they let register to vote. And so he came back and told the rest of us. So, you know, we really had a good class action suit. And that case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And it ruled that students all over the country basically had the right to decide where they declare as their residence. But with that being said, it still was a struggle for Waller County to get grip on this, because now you got this old guard Confederate mindset that's still prevalent, just right beneath the surface, this unequal stuff. And you got a land grant that contributes to the local economy in a major way. We did the economic impact of this university, and it's a game changer for Waller County. But still, a lot of the development has been retarded or kept from coming in. We've been redlined, we understand it. So the student vote was a fear that if the students actually got mobilized, they could change the whole elections of Waller County. And so we went through a long process with district attorneys and indictments of students. And so the students prevailed, except for this last time. They after they had neutered the Voting Rights Act, all those sections, they were able to stop us for this last lawsuit that we filed, because the students wanted a permanent voting site in their student center like the other universities have. And they said, no, we want y'all to go out to the community center, which means you got to make that extra effort. And young folks don't look at things the same way we look at them. So they may say, well, I'll go vote later, you know, because I'm going to class, I'm eating, I got to go see my girl, my guy, whatever. And so, you know, it made it a little bit more of a challenge. So Waller County, when I first got involved in politics locally, like in '82, after I got on the city council, Waller County was solid Democrat. As a matter of fact, people in Waller County call themselves yellow dog Democrats. They say, before I vote for a Republican, I'll vote for a yellow dog. I mean, that's how cold it was. But then when we all were pushing to keep Democrats in power in Waller County and in Texas, then all of a sudden it flipped. We said, wait a minute. We saw Ann Richards get defeated. We saw this, wait a minute. And here in Waller County, all of the same people from the sheriff and all the judges and clerks, tax assessors, all of them flipped. And it just left mostly African American out here by themselves. Where they go? They shifted. So Waller County is now predominantly Republican. The same people. It's flipped. So why'd y'all do that? Because we come to know that the Republicans had adopted some of those same ideas that the old guard Democrats used to have. Because once African Americans, we had to sue to get into the Democratic Party. You know, we had to fight them to get in because they killed the Republican Party back with Kennedy. They had neutered it because we were all Republicans then. And so then we got in the Democratic Party and started putting in women and started being a game changer. So we still going through those struggles here. And because we got active with it, we were able to kind of keep the voting lines strong enough where Prairie View can at least have a strong voice in one voting precinct, precinct 3. That's we got a county commissioner. I've held a job for 8 years as county commissioner because we wanted to see could it be done. And then we had the JP and we had the constable. So they gave us a voice on commissioner's court. And what we found out that actually helped though is when we get people involved in the community and start building relationships. And so in 1986, we created a volunteer fire department to protect our area. And we joined with the other local volunteer fire departments and we built relationships. So I've been serving as fire chief since 1986. And so when you go into an effort like that with fire departments, you start building bonds. And so we've been bonding and we got students now that are becoming state certified firefighters, state certified EMTs, paramedics, and they're serving these other communities. So now the people in Wall and Hempstead who may not have been as welcoming to these students now are seeing the kids drive their fire truck or jump out the back of an ambulance and say, whoa, are those? Yeah, that's who they are. We're here to help. And so that's been a game changer to us. And so we know that the more involved we get with the community, the more people get to know you and get beyond that craziness, the better off all of us are gonna be. And so it's been a real challenge here in Waller County to see this transition. But we keep in mind that what Dr. Woodfolk said in his book on Prairie View, this is the definitive book on Prairie View. It's called Prairie View, A Study in Public Conscience by Dr. George Rubel Woodfolk, who was my mentor. And Dr. Woodfolk said political and economic dominance within the arena of national power by any group or groups can lead to a cultural aggression that's designed to alter or reshape the total cultural milieu of the vanquished. And so as African Americans, we know that once we were conquered and enslaved, we lost our language. I'm not an Englishman, even though I'm speaking here in English, but all of our language may have been Igbo, may have been Fulani, may have been Ashanti, but all that was wiped from our mind. We adopted the Europeans that here, even though we had Christianity over in Ethiopia and other places in Africa, but on the West African coast, we probably were Muslim. When they conquered us, then we had our own religion. We had gods, Olodumare, Biliange, Wiri, Ogun. Right. So it reshaped our culture. And when you're reshaping a people's culture, you can further dominate it. And so now we got to recover our memory. And so teaching African American studies, we didn't start doing that till this year, well, last year. And so when Dr. Simmons came in, Bruce Simmons, our new president, came in, she said, why don't y'all teach African American studies? Oh, interesting, man.
And so for the last question I have, I don't want to hold you too long, Mr. Jackson. By the way, you can still see him. You always know it's him. He drives to the campus in his fire chief truck. You can always know it's him. And he usually has a hat on, so you can always see him rolling. Just about, the theme, I guess, kind of about domination and using power and influence to kind of keep the schools and by that extension, the students and the staff back in a certain place. How do you think that has influenced this notion that is out there that, getting an education at HBCU is a second-class education? How do you think that all kind of ties together? I just want to put a button on it.
Yeah, Prairie View is a game changer, and all HBCUs, Texas Southern, all of us, in spite of the low appropriations, we don't get equal appropriations. We've watched this over time, and over the 20 years I spent in Austin monitoring the legislature, it's just clear as day that there's inequality in appropriation. But that it's the public policy that we really have to start tracking, because if you notice the laws of the state of Texas, they're designed to shape the culture. And you start seeing it now, the lieutenant governor say he's gonna file a bill and get rid of that CRT. Why are you doing that? Well, you're teaching all this stuff and we're gonna pull the books, we're gonna ban the books. And we said, Lord have mercy. Instead of having a healthy conversation about this, folks are filing bills and changing the culture dynamic. So Prairie View is that place that gave folks like me a chance. I couldn't have gotten into the University of Texas, especially once we desegregated when I was in the 9th grade, because we took 35 kids from my little small town in my class over to Luling High School. Only 9 of us graduated because we saw the pressures and we were not as inclusive. They weren't as inclusive with us as what we had over at Rosenwald High School, Luling, Texas, even though it was inferior for the physical plant to the white school. We at least had a place and position. We knew who we were. We would be part of the student government. We'd be part of the football team, basketball. We would be a part of that community that was the Black community. But once the leadership was gone and we were integrated, we no longer fit into that world. We didn't blend in as good because my mother cooked for folks or kept folks' homes. And so we didn't get the same equal treatment that, say, our classmates got. And so a lot of us were put in remedial classes. I was put in remedial math. And so I was under the impression I couldn't learn math. My mother, she asked me to find out how much it would cost her to let me take algebra in summer school. And I found out they was charging $35 for a summer school session. She said, I'm going to work these little small jobs and raise this $35. And if you don't make an A, I'm gonna beat all the Black off of it. So, I made an A. And so it let me know I could learn, it's under threat. But I mean, if you didn't have these dominant women and men that saw different for us, in the same way at Prairie View. See, Prairie View's always been special, even though they had this oversight from A&M and from the state watching them, watching what are y'all doing down there? What's going on down there at Prairie View? They said, we teaching them how to saw and weld and do all this ag and all that. But there was always a genius here, but operating beneath the radar that would say, you come in, little girl, little guy, you need to be in math. You need to be over here. And they would pull you in and work with you. And somebody grabbed me and pulled me in. Said, come here, boy, sit down. Let's talk. I mean, you don't get that at the majority school. We didn't get that at Luling High School. We got it at Rosenwald. We didn't get it at the white school, but we got it at Prairie View. And like I said, when we got there and they had us in ROTC, they had us shining our shoes, polishing brass, but we were learning discipline. We was learning how to lead. And we didn't realize that Dr. Thomas just showing us how to eat meant something, because Mama had some nice china, but we hardly ever used it. It was mostly for decoration in her china cabinet. But on board the ship, officers ate off this stuff, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So he had to show us how to compete in the mainstream. And it was interesting because I had to have each officer, junior officer had to eat with the captain and the admiral. And my time came. And so the conversation first centered around sports. And they said, well, we'll open up. I said, well, I'm not a big sports fanatic. I don't know all the stats. And I said, but I read this book by Fyodor Dostoevsky, the brothers Karamazov. This is my favorite chapter, and I went on to change the conversation.
All right, thank you. We appreciate it, David. I think we can kind of close out.
Yeah, we can. I actually have one question.
Okay, yeah, sure.
If there's a minute for it. I'm what am I? I'm somewhat speechless as I'm listening to these stories and getting this really detailed and layered biography and history. And so I'm partly not trusting my own ears sometimes. But I think I heard you say, Mr. Jackson, that that only just recently there's courses offered in African American studies. And if I heard that correctly, I'm wondering, is that tied to state funding issues and not wanting the university to appear as some kind of a threat or something because it's teaching African American history and culture and possibly CRT? Is that the reason, or is there another reason?
Well, I haven't done enough in-depth research into that, but I know that several years ago, before Dr. Simmons came to be our president, we had another president. He was a noted African-American historian. And we kept on saying, Doc, we need to teach the kids African-American history. And as a noted African-American historian that taught African-American history at the University of Texas and other colleges, and had books. And you said, wait a minute, our kids don't know who they are. But first thing Dr. Simmons said, why don't we teach this? So she started setting the groundwork for it and set up the Ruth J. Simmons Center. And Patrick probably speak to it better than I can. But, this was a game changer for our kids. They need to know who they are. And I don't think Texas Southern has it either. But you go to UT, you go to University of Houston, they had a well-developed African-American studies program, So other folks are learning about you, but you're not learning about yourself. That, to me, that's not good. That's almost criminal to be that. But then it leads you to think, why? Why would somebody be so concerned about that veil coming up? And that goes back to DuBose. That's why I like stuff with DuBose, is that the older Southerners said, out of pure self-defense, you don't let them. Because if you lift that veil, they're gonna wake up and say, whoa.
Yeah.
You know what you did? Let's fix this thing. And that changes, that's a game changer. That's a game changer because everybody that has suffered under this, and we have this illusion of a democracy. But when you do the law we live there, where the law history of who could vote in America, whoa, where the women? Only white men with land, it just followed on through. And each group that got it had to suffer to get it and to suffer to hold on. So is it a true democracy? So, whoa, wait a minute, what we got going here? It makes us question the whole enterprise. Even though we've bought off on it to protect it and to develop it, it makes us look at everything and say, what do we want to leave for our children? Because our children don't understand a lot of this stuff and they learn all this prejudice and racism from us. So if you start pushing the notion that there's only one human family on this planet, only one race, as humanity, all this other stuff is some biological, not biological fact, but a political idea. Because I got nephews that, and I got a granddaughter that's part Irish. What do I tell her?
I think part of it too is for a lot of the history of many of these campuses, it's the imperative, because remember you got a lot of first generation students, you got a lot of students coming out of poverty, a lot of students that, everybody in the church and everybody in the neighborhood, everybody in the block put a little money together and like, here baby, this is all we got, go to school. And so for a lot of the thinking of people on campuses is, okay, we got them here. We need to figure out what major can we get them in to get them, gainfully employed, help them lift them out of poverty. What can we do to help get them a job? And many times there's a term for it, I can't think it was, those majors that may looked at more almost, lack of a better term, soft majors that didn't really lead directly somewhere. If you go be a biology major, you can go to med school, you're gonna be a dentist, you go be this major, you're gonna be a lawyer, you go this major, you can be a vet. It's a direct path somewhere. And many people saw, okay, African-American studies or something like that. Where is that gonna lead you? Because we can't send you back home to your mama and your daddy and big mama and Pastor Smith that, raised some money for you with this major that they can't figure out where it goes to directly. So I think that was some of the thinking of it for a long time. Like, we got them here. We got to send them back home with something that they can use right now. I think that was part of it as well.
And can I add something? I mean, also for HBCUs, it was also embedded already. When I first got to Lincoln, my first semester, English 1, we read 4 books. Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, The Miseducation of the Negro, and The Souls of Black Folk by Du Bois. Those were the first 4 books I read. My freshman year, first semester, every student who goes to English 1 at Lincoln University reads those 4 books. And so for many of the HBCUs, Howard University does a very similar thing. So does Morehouse and Spelman. So for HBCUs, it was also embedded in our curriculum because we couldn't be as overt if we were going to get funding from the state, if we were going to get the kind of support that financially that we wanted to get from some of the white institutions that founded some of the HBCUs. And so I have found in my work that it was also embedded in the curricula so deeply that they also didn't see the need to have an African-American studies major. I mean, Lincoln didn't get an African-American studies major until 1998. Right? By the Malefi K.T. Asante was running the top African-American history program at Temple University, 40 minutes away at one of the largest white universities, right? The founder of Afrocentricity, right? But Lincoln, right up the road, did not get an African-American studies major until 1998. But it was also embedded in the culture. So although there wasn't a major, Black folk were still leaving HBCUs with a foundational grounding centered in who they were. At least that's what I found. That we were still getting those nourishments that we needed as it relates to who we were, at least in my experience.
I'm really grateful for
I would agree with that. Same thing, Xavier. It was kind of, whether it's history, whether it's English, whether it was art, whether it was my music appreciation class. I mean, it was kind of steeped all through. So I agree with that too.
I really appreciate hearing from all of you and for all of your time today. Thank you for your many contributions. We wish you well. Hope to see you back next Monday as we think about gentrification and race together. And a special thank you to Patrick and Mr. Jackson.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Mr. Jackson, I appreciate you. I owe you lunch.
It's
Thank you
good,
so
huh?
much for this enjoyable, enlightening conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, man. It was a blessing and privilege to commune with all of y'all and to listen. You holding it down, Black man. You the fire chief. And Admiral of the Navy. I mean, you really put it down, Black man. You got the statues. That's what I'm talking about. This is really good encouragement, man, to keep it up, keep doing right. Thank you so much, brother. It's nation time.
Thank you. All right. Appreciate y'all. Bye.
Appreciate you, Frank.
All right, thank you.
Okay, and you guys remember Anna had a very important meeting. I hope it went well because it was a meeting to help her campus. So
Yeah. Thank you all. Good to be together.
Yeah, it is.
sounded good. Okay, see you guys tomorrow.
See you.
Thanks.
Bye.